Start. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: Queen takes pawn. Check. The answer is: Queen takes pawn. Check. Rook takes queen. Rook to e1. Check. Rook to f1. Bishop takes pawn. Check. King to h1. Rook takes rook. Checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: Rook takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Check. The checks are: Queen to c1. Check. Bishop takes pawn. Check. The best move in puzzle position is: Queen to c1. Check. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook. Check. Bishop takes rook. Rook to e1. Checkmate. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: Queen takes pawn. The checks are: h3. Check. Queen to c4. Check. Queen to c8. Check. Queen to f4. Check. Queen to g5. Check. Queen to d1. Check. The answer is: Queen to f4. Check. King to h5. Queen to f5. Checkmate. Another one. The threats are: Queen takes pawn. Check. Queen takes rook. Here are the checks: e6. Check. Queen to f5. Check. Queen to e6. Check. Queen to d7. Check. Queen to g6. Check. Queen takes pawn. Check. Queen to h5. Check. Answer to this puzzle is: Queen to e6. Check. King to f8. Knight to g6. Checkmate. Next puzzle, the threats are: Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position: Queen to c8. Check. Queen to d7. Check. Queen to e7. Check. Queen to f7. Check. Queen takes pawn. Check. Knight to f4. Check. Answer to this puzzle is: Queen to e7. Check. King to f5. Knight to e3. Checkmate. Next, the threats are: Rook takes rook. Check. Rook takes pawn. Check. Checks in puzzle position are: Rook takes rook. Check. Rook takes pawn. Check. Answer to this puzzle is: Rook takes rook. Check. King takes rook. g7. Promotes to queen. Promotes to queen. Checkmate. Another puzzle. Here are the threats: Knight takes bishop. Check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: Knight takes bishop. Check. Knight to f8. Check. Knight to h8. Check. Knight to h4. Check. Knight to f4. Check. Knight to e5. Check. Solution to the puzzle is: Knight to f8. Check. King to g8. Queen to h7. Check. King takes knight. Queen to h8. Checkmate. Next puzzle, threats in puzzle position are: Bishop takes queen. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Check. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Check. The checks are: Bishop takes pawn. Check. Queen takes pawn. Check. Answer to this puzzle is: Queen takes pawn. Check. Rook takes queen. Rook to d1. Check. Knight to e1. Rook takes knight. Checkmate. Let's continue. The threats are: There are no threats in this position. The checks are: Knight to g6. Check. Bishop to e7. Check. Bishop to h6. Check. Rook to e8. Check. Rook to f1. Check. The answer is: Bishop to h6. Check. King to g8. Rook to e8. Check. Knight to f8. Rook takes knight. Checkmate. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are: Queen takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are: Queen to f6. Check. Queen to h7. Check. Queen to g5. Check. Queen to h5. Check. Queen to g4. Check. Queen to h3. Check. Bishop to e1. Check. The puzzle is solved using: Bishop to e1. Check. Queen to g3. Queen to g5. Check. King to h3. Queen takes queen. Checkmate. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are: Rook to a8. Check. Rook to f7. Check. Bishop to d6, check. Queen to b4, check. Queen to e7, check. Queen to e8, check. The puzzle is solved using Queen to e7, check. King to g8. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. Next, the threats are knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes knight. The checks are knight to e7, check. Knight to h6, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to h6, check. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. One more, threats in puzzle position are bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to b6, check. Knight to e7, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to b6, check. Pawn takes knight. Queen to a8, check. Knight to b8. Queen takes knight, checkmate. Another puzzle, the threats are queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to b8, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to d8, check. Queen to d7, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen to c6, check. Rook to d8, check. Bishop to f7, check. The answer is queen to d7, check. King to f8. Queen to d8, check. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are knight takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen to e6, check. Queen to d7, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to h5, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to e6, check. King to f8. Knight to d7, checkmate. Another one, the threats are pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to f8, check. Rook to g7, check. h7, check. Solution to the puzzle is h7, check. King to h8. Queen to f6, check. Rook to g7. Queen takes rook, checkmate. Another puzzle, threats in this position are there are no threats in this position. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to b8, check. Rook to c7, check. Rook to e8, check. Rook to c7, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to c7, check. King to d8. Rook to b8, checkmate. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes queen. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes pawn, check. King to h1. Queen to g1, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in this position are there are no threats in this position. The checks are rook to h1, check. Bishop to h2, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to h1, check. King takes rook. Queen to h6, check. King to g1. Queen to h2, check. King to f1. Queen to h1, checkmate. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Knight to d6, check. Knight to e7, check. Knight to g7, check. Knight to h6, check. Knight to h4, check. Knight to g3, check. Knight to e3, check. f4, check. h4, check. Queen takes rook, check. The answer is h4, check. King to f4. Rook to e4, check. Pawn takes rook. Rook takes pawn, checkmate. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Checks in puzzle position are queen to g2, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen takes knight, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to g2, check. Bishop takes queen. Pawn takes bishop, check. King to g1. Rook to h1, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to f7, check. Bishop to b5, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to f7, check. Bishop to e6. Bishop takes bishop, checkmate. Another one, here are the threats. Queen takes bishop, check. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes bishop, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to d3, check. Rook to c1, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes bishop, check. Knight takes queen. Rook to c1, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to a8, check. Rook to e7, check. Bishop to c6, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop to c6, check. King to d8. Bishop to a5, check. King to c8. Rook to a8, checkmate. Next puzzle, the threats are rook takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to d1, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to d1, check. Rook to f1. Rook takes pawn, check. King to h1. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.